Abandoned widow inherited her husband's property and faced the beast everyone warned her about. The gate does not open on its own. It takes her shoulder against splintered wood, both hands, and a breath held too long. And behind it, in the dark of the barn, something exhales like a furnace. Not a bark, not a neigh, a sound low enough to live in the chest before it reaches the ears. She does not step back. That, more than anything else that will happen in the weeks to come, is the first sign that something in this woman has already changed. Before the story goes further, a question worth sitting with. What would you do if the last decision your husband ever made turned out to be the one thing everyone in town wanted you to destroy? Would you trust a dead man's silence or the living world's warnings? Stay with this one until the end. There is a moment near the final stretch, at the water trough, that changes the way this whole story reads backward. If a story like this has ever found you at the right time, tap the like button, subscribe so the next one finds you too, and tell us in the comments which city or town you're watching from tonight. Now, Montana, early autumn, the wind already sharp enough to cut. The funeral is 3 days behind her by the time Nesta Calloway understands that grief, unlike a marriage, does not come with instructions. The house in town, the one she and Everett shared for 26 years, the one with the porch swing he never got around to fixing, sold faster than she expected and for less than she needed. What remains of that life fits into the bed of a borrowed truck. 2 suitcases, a cedar box of photographs, a folded flag from Everett's brief service decades ago, and an envelope of papers a lawyer in Billings pushed across a desk with the particular gentleness reserved for people who have just lost everything twice. The papers say the farm is hers. 400 acres of dry grass and standing fence posts, 2 hours north of anywhere that matters, purchased 11 months ago for a sum that emptied every account they had built together. Everett never mentioned it. Not once. Not in the quiet hours before sleep. Not in the last ordinary Tuesday morning when he kissed her forehead and drove to the feed store and did not come home. The heart attack took him in the parking lot. According to the man who found him, quickly, without warning, the way storms sometimes arrive in that country. No clouds, just wind, and then everything different. She drives north with the radio off. The land changes the way grief changes a face. Gradually, then all at once. Trees give way to grass. Grass gives way to more grass. Fences lean like old men learning to accept gravity. By the time the mailbox with Calloway stenciled in Everett's careful hand appears at the end of a gravel drive, the sun sits low and orange, throwing long shadows from a farmhouse that has clearly not been lived in for longer than 11 months. The porch boards give under her weight. Dust sits thick on every windowsill inside, undisturbed, and yet, this is the detail that stops her hand on the doorframe. Someone has been coming out here anyway. Fresh tire tracks in the drive. A stack of unopened feed bags in the mudroom, dated only 6 weeks back. And from somewhere past the house, past the tilted windmill and the empty chicken coop, a sound that does not belong to an abandoned property. Heavy hooves against wood, again and again, like something testing the limits of a cage. She does not go to the barn that first night. She sits instead at the kitchen table with the envelope of papers, reading by lantern light because the power was never reconnected, searching every page for an answer Everett never gave her while he was alive. There is a deed, a payment schedule, mostly satisfied, and near the bottom, in different ink, a single handwritten note in her husband's hand that she reads 4 times before she lets herself understand it. Don't let them take him. No name, no explanation. Just 5 words from a man who apparently spent the last money they had on something he never once mentioned and died before he could say why. Morning brings the neighbors, or what passes for neighbors this far out. A truck idling at the end of the drive, engine running. A man in a pressed shirt who does not get out until she walks toward him first. Clive Harmon introduces himself as though the introduction is a formality. President of the County Ranchers Co-op, a man whose handshake is exactly 1 degree too firm. He offers condolences that arrive already wrapped around a proposition. He knew Everett, he says, did business with him. In fact, the loan that helped finance this very property came through the co-op's lending arm, through Clive's own signature. He glances toward the barn only once, but the glance lingers half a second longer than the rest of his face allows, and something in that half second tells her more than his words do. There is a horse in there, he says finally, that should have been put down months ago. He says the word liability the way other men say shame. He says Everett bought the animal at auction for almost nothing, against everyone's advice, out of some sentiment nobody in town ever understood. He says the horse has hurt 2 men trying to load him, that the state has already been notified once, that it would be a mercy, frankly, all things considered, for everyone involved. Nesta says very little. She has spent 26 years learning the particular silence of a woman who lets men finish their sentences before deciding whether to believe them. When Clive finally drives away, dust rising behind his truck like a closing curtain, she stands alone in the yard longer than the moment requires, looking toward the barn, toward the sound still coming from inside it, steady, angry, afraid. She walks toward it anyway. The barn door is barred from the outside. Thick oak crossbeam dropped into iron brackets, the kind of latch built by a man who did not want something getting out. Through the gaps between boards, motion. Something enormous, pacing the length of a stall too small for it, throwing its weight against the wood with a violence that makes the whole structure groan. She has never in her life seen an animal move like that. Not the frantic energy of fear alone, but something more deliberate, more exhausted, like a prisoner testing walls it has tested 1,000 times before and no longer expects to fall. She does not lift the beam. Not yet. Instead, she circles the barn's exterior, counting the boards that have been kicked loose and replaced, the fresh lumber nailed hastily over splintered older wood, evidence of a battle that has clearly been fought here more than once. Near the back, a smaller window, boarded from outside but with enough gap between slats to let in a blade of afternoon light. She presses her eye to it. The horse inside is black from nose to tail, but not the glossy black of show animals. This is a black scarred with old white lines across the shoulder and flank, a black dulled by dust and neglect, muscle wasted in places it should not be. One ear sits permanently back, a small tear healed wrong along its edge, and the left eye, the one nearest her, holds a milky cloud across its surface that has nothing to do with anger and everything to do with the simple fact that the animal cannot fully see out of it. He rams the stall wall again. Somewhere near the front, a feed trough sits knocked sideways, hay scattered and mostly untouched. A water bucket, nearly empty, has been tipped and not refilled. Whatever hand has been coming out here to drop feed bags in the mudroom has clearly stopped short of coming close enough to actually feed him. That evening, at the kitchen table, she finds the letters. They were tucked inside the same lawyer's envelope, beneath the deed, easy to miss unless a person is looking for exactly the kind of thing grief makes people look for, proof that they were loved on purpose. 24 letters, folded and refolded so many times the creases have gone soft as cloth, dated across the first year of their marriage, 26 years ago, before children they never had, before the mortgage on the townhouse, before either of them learned what disappointment sounded like when it settled permanently into a room. The handwriting in these letters belongs to a younger Everett, one she remembers only in fragments now. A man who wrote, "I think of you before I think of anything else," every single morning, and I intend to keep it that way until I run out of mornings without embarrassment, without the careful distance that crept into every conversation they had in later years. She reads 3 of them at the table before the lantern gutters low, and somewhere past midnight, without entirely deciding to, she carries the whole stack out to the barn. The horse goes still when the door creaks. Not calm, alert, coiled, the good eye tracking her across the dark interior while the blind side keeps his head angled defensively away. She does not approach the stall. She sits instead on an overturned bucket a full 10 feet back, close enough to be heard, far enough to pose no threat, and she begins to read one of the letters aloud into the dark, her voice unsteady at first, and then steadier, filling a space that has apparently held nothing but silence and violence for 11 months. The horse does not settle immediately, but somewhere around the 4th letter, the pacing slows. By the 6th, he has stopped moving altogether, standing motionless at the far side of the stall, ears no longer flattened, head lowered by degrees so gradual they are almost impossible to notice happening, until she looks up between letters and finds him closer to the front rail than he was an hour before, watching her now instead of watching the door. She returns the following night, and the one after that, each time a little closer, each time a little longer before the pacing starts up again after she leaves. On the 4th night, reading a letter about a honeymoon neither of them could afford but took anyway, driving the coastline with the windows down and no plan past the next town. She looks up to find the horse has crossed the entire stall and pressed his forehead flat against the top rail, eyes closed, utterly still, the way a man might lean into a wall he no longer has the strength to stand away from. She does not reach out, not yet, but she sits there long after the letter ends, in silence, and neither of them moves, and something in the barn that has held only fear for nearly a year finally, briefly, holds something else instead. The next morning, driving into the nearest town for supplies, she learns the horse has a name, Goliath. The feed store clerk says it like a warning, tells her 2 ranch hands quit over that animal, tells her the county already has a file open on the property, tells her, almost kindly, almost as an afterthought, that Clive Harmon has been telling anyone who'll listen that the widow out at the old Callaway place won't last the season. She buys twice the feed she came for and says nothing at all. Word travels fast in country this empty, faster than it ever did in town, carried less by phone lines than by the simple fact that everyone already knows everyone else's business and is only waiting for permission to discuss it out loud. By the second week, Nesta understands she is being watched, not overtly, not with any single confrontation, but in the way trucks slow slightly when they pass the end of her drive, in the way the woman at the general store asks after her health with an attention that feels more like inventory than concern. Clive returns on a Thursday, and this time he does not stay in his truck. He walks the property with the easy proprietary stride of a man who has already decided, somewhere in his own mind, how this all ends. He inspects the barn from the outside, notes the loose boards, makes a small sound of disapproval that costs him nothing and is meant to cost her something. When he finally states his offer plainly, it arrives dressed as generosity. The remaining balance on the property forgiven entirely, plus a modest monthly sum from the co-op's community fund, enough for her to live out her years somewhere warmer, somewhere easier, somewhere that does not require carrying water or facing down an animal 3 times her weight and half again as unpredictable. All she has to do is sign the surrender papers already sitting, prepared in advance, in a folder under his arm. She asks him, quietly, why the co-op cares so much about one horse on one small farm. He answers too quickly for the answer to be the whole truth. Something about liability insurance, about the highway expansion project the county has been planning for years, about land values and safety codes, and the burden a widow alone could never reasonably be expected to carry. His eyes go, again, to the barn, and this time the glance is longer, hungrier, the look of a man who has already priced land he does not yet own. She tells him she needs time to think. He tells her, not unkindly, that the offer will not stay open forever, and that animals like that one have a way of making the decision for you eventually, one way or another. That night, for the first time, she opens the barn door instead of standing outside it. Goliath startles, backs into the corner of the stall, the good eye wide, the bad side turned protectively toward the wall, but he does not charge the rail, does not slam his weight against the wood the way he did that first evening. She sits on the overturned bucket, closer now, close enough that when she reads the next letter, one where a younger Everett describes teaching himself to ride as a boy, describes a horse his own father sold out from under him without warning one autumn, describes a grief he apparently carried quietly for the rest of his life, without ever once naming it to her. Goliath's ears turn fully forward, tracking not just her voice, but something in it that seems to recognize the shape of the story. It comes to her slowly, over the following nights, piecing together fragments. Her husband did not buy this animal on a whim, or out of sentiment nobody understood, as Clive suggested. He bought a horse being sold for slaughter because it reminded him of something he lost as a child and never once spoke of in 26 years of marriage. He drove 2 hours north to save an animal from the exact fate his own father inflicted on him, and he never told his wife any of it, because some griefs, apparently, are easier to act on in silence than to explain out loud. The revelation sits heavy in her chest through the following days, not sorrow exactly, and not quite anger, something closer to the particular ache of understanding a person better after they are gone than she ever managed while he was alive. The water arrives to remind her how precarious her position truly is. She turns the kitchen tap one gray morning and nothing comes. No groan of old pipes. No sputter. Nothing at all. A call to the county utility office produces a clerk who cites, apologetically, a shared well agreement between several properties along the ridge, an agreement that requires the signature and continued goodwill of the co-op board to remain active. The message beneath the message is not subtle. Clive has cut the line. She stands at the dry tap for a long moment, then walks out past the barn to where a narrow creek cuts through the lower pasture. A quarter-mile down a slope steep enough to make the return trip brutal. She fills 2 buckets, carries them back with her arms shaking by the final 100 yards, and understands, setting them down on the porch, that this will now be her daily life for as long as she refuses to sign Clive's papers, twice a day, morning and evening, a quarter-mile down and a quarter-mile back, sun overhead like a hand pressing down on her shoulders. She does it anyway, the following morning and the morning after that. On the 5th day of hauling water, her legs give out on the final rise, both buckets tipping into the dust, months of grief and exhaustion finally arriving all at once in the middle of an empty field with no one to see it happen. She sits in the dirt beside the spilled water for longer than she means to, and when she finally looks up, Goliath is standing at the barn's open door, the door she left ajar that morning without quite deciding to, watching her from 50 yards away, utterly still, the good eye fixed on her the way a man watches a storm to see which direction it intends to break. Nesta rebuilds the barn's damaged sections herself, or as close to herself as 30 years of never having touched a hammer allows. Her hands blister and split. Splinters work their way under 3 fingernails before she learns to hold the boards steady with her knee instead of her palm. Everett's tools, still hanging in the shed exactly where he left them, feel foreign in her grip for the first several days, and then, slowly, less so. She learns the horse's rhythms the way a person learns a language nobody bothered to teach them, through repetition, through mistakes, through paying close attention to what makes the ears go back and what makes them come forward. She learns that Goliath spooks hardest from his blind side, that any sudden approach from the left sends him instantly back to the stall's far corner, but that the same motion made slowly, telegraphed, met with her voice first and her hand only after, produces something closer to tolerance than fear. The letters continue each evening, though she has read through most of them twice now, and has begun, without quite planning to, telling him things of her own instead, not confessions exactly, nothing so dramatic, but small observations spoken aloud into the dark. How the wind sounds different out here than it did in town. How she has started sleeping in the front room because the back bedroom still smells faintly of Everett's aftershave, and she has not yet decided whether that comfort is worth the ache that comes with it. How she has begun, for the first time in 26 years, making decisions with no one to check them against. The first time she offers her hand flat through the stall rail, palm open, feed resting in it. Goliath does not approach for nearly 10 minutes. When he finally does, the movement is agonizingly slow, muscle held tight the entire way, prepared to bolt at the first sign of a trick. His lips brush her palm. He takes the feed. He does not immediately retreat. It is not trust, not yet. It is closer to a truce, tentative and easily broken. But it is the first genuine contact either of them has allowed since she arrived. Clive does not wait quietly for her answer. Word reaches her through the same feed store clerk that he has been telling the co-op board she is failing to properly care for the animal, that the water situation alone constitutes negligence, that a formal complaint to the state agricultural office would be the responsible thing to do, for everyone's sake, including the horses. The clerk delivers this information the way people deliver warnings they feel guilty about delivering, quickly, without meeting her eyes, already moving toward the next customer before she can respond. She drives home that afternoon past the turnoff to the county road expansion survey markers, freshly staked flags marking a route that, she now understands looking at the map pinned in the co-op office window, would run directly through what is currently her western pasture. The exact stretch of land Clive has spent 2 visits now describing as unnecessary, unsafe, better used for something else entirely. The picture assembles itself with the particular clarity that arrives only after enough pieces have accumulated to force it. This was never about one horse. It was never really about a widow's ability to manage a farm alone. It is about 400 acres sitting precisely where a highway wants to go, and one animal too dangerous sounding, too easy to make sound dangerous, standing in the way of the paperwork that would make the acquisition simple. That night, she does not read letters. She sits instead in silence outside the stall, working through what she now understands, and Goliath, perhaps sensing the shift in her stillness, perhaps simply grown accustomed to her presence by now, steps forward on his own for the first time, crossing the stall without her hand extended, without feet offered, and lowers his head until his forehead rests against the rail directly in front of her, close enough that she could touch him if she chose to. She does, her palm against his cheek, just below the clouded eye, and he does not flinch away. The following morning, the county utility office calls again, this time with different news. An inspector will be visiting within the week, following a formal complaint regarding animal welfare conditions on the property. The voice on the phone is polite, procedural, entirely uninterested in the fact that the water shortage prompting any negligence in the first place was engineered by the same man now filing complaints about it. She hangs up the phone and stands very still in the kitchen for a long moment before walking, without quite deciding to, back out toward the barn. The days before the inspection compress into something close to a siege. Nesta hauls water twice daily still, but now also scrubs the stall clean of months of accumulated grime, replaces rotted boards throughout the structure, repairs the fence line along the eastern pasture where Goliath will need room to move freely if the inspector insists on seeing him outside a confined space. Her hands, healed from the earlier blisters, split open again along the same lines. She does not stop. Goliath's transformation, meanwhile, happens in increments too small to notice day to day and impossible to miss looking back a week later. He accepts the halter for the first time on a Tuesday evening, not calmly, not without a long charged moment where his whole body goes rigid beneath her hand and the good eye rolls white at the edges, but he accepts it and does not fight the lead rope once it is clipped and stands beside her in the yard afterward, breathing hard through flared nostrils while she keeps her palm flat against his neck, saying nothing, letting the moment pass without demanding anything further from it. 2 days before the inspection, she walks him to the creek for the first time, leading rather than carrying every bucket herself. He balks twice at the steep drop of the slope, once at the sound of water moving over stone, a sound perhaps unfamiliar or perhaps simply associated in his memory with something she will never fully know. But he follows. At the creek's edge, she fills the buckets and, without planning the gesture in advance, drapes the looped handles over the pommel of an old pack saddle she found hanging in the shed and had, on impulse, thrown over his back that morning. A saddle he had allowed, standing rigid but still, ears pinned but hooves planted. He carries the water back up the slope beside her. Neither of them speaks, in the sense that only one of them ever could, but the walk back is different from every walk that came before it. A task shared rather than a burden endured, the animal's enormous frame moving in patient rhythm alongside her smaller one. Sunlight throwing their combined shadow long and strange across the dry grass. Clive arrives unannounced the following evening, ostensibly to check on the property's condition ahead of the inspection, though his visit carries the particular tension of a man discovering the ground shifting beneath a plan he considered settled. He finds Nesta in the yard, Goliath haltered and calm beside her, drinking from a full trough she filled from the creek that morning. Clive's expression, for the first time since they met, holds something other than practiced sympathy, something closer to alarm, quickly smoothed over, but not quickly enough to go unnoticed. He mentions, almost too casually, that the inspector coming Thursday is a man named Marsh, thorough, by the book, not someone easily swayed by appearances. He mentions that a horse behaving calmly in front of its owner proves nothing about what happens when a stranger approaches. He mentions, finally, nearly at the truck door, that it would be a shame, genuinely, he insists, a shame, for things to end badly for everyone involved, when a simple signature could still resolve all of it cleanly. Nesta says nothing in response beyond a level look that holds until his truck pulls away. That night, alone with the horse in the deepening dark, she reads the final letter in the stack for the first time, one she had been saving, whether consciously or not, dated only weeks before Everett's death, written but apparently never sent, tucked separately from the others in an inside pocket of the envelope. In it, a version of her husband closer to the man who died than the boy who wrote the earlier pages describes, in careful, halting language entirely unlike his usual reserve, a decision he has made and has not yet found the courage to explain to her. a farm, an animal nobody else wanted, a debt he intends to repay quietly before telling her any of it, so that by the time she learned the full story, it would already be a solved problem rather than a burden he was asking her to carry. He never got the chance to finish solving it. She sits with that letter longer than any of the others, and when she finally looks up, Goliath is standing at the stall rail, unprompted, forehead lowered, waiting. Thursday arrives with a sky the color of old iron, wind moving low across the pasture in long, unbroken sweeps that bend the grass flat and rattle the loose tin on the barn roof. Two vehicles come up the drive within minutes of each other, a state agricultural truck, and behind it, close enough to suggest coordination rather than coincidence, Clive's own. Marsh proves to be exactly what Clive promised, a compact, unhurried man with a clipboard and a manner that gives nothing away, the kind of inspector who has clearly seen every version of a nervous property owner trying to hide something and long ago stopped being impressed by any of them. He walks the barn's interior first, noting the repaired boards, the clean stall, the full water trough, making small marks on his clipboard that Nesta cannot read from where she stands and does not ask about. Clive, trailing a half step behind, supplies commentary Marsh did not request. Mentions of the earlier complaints, the history of aggression, the two ranch hands injured before Everett's death, the general danger of allowing an animal of this size and temperament to remain under the care of a woman alone, without proper equipment or experience. Marsh listens without visibly agreeing or disagreeing, which seems to unsettle Clive more than outright skepticism would. The moment that decides everything arrives without warning, the way the important moments in this story always have. Marsh asks, in the flat procedural tone of a man working through a checklist, to see the animal handled outside the stall, in open space, to assess temperament directly rather than through second-hand accounts. Clive's posture shifts almost imperceptibly at this. A small, satisfied stillness, the expression of a man who believes he already knows how this particular test will end. Nesta walks to the stall door. Her hand rests on the latch for a long moment, long enough that even Marsh glances up from his clipboard. And then, instead of reaching for the halter hanging on its hook beside the door, she does something else entirely. She lifts the latch and swings the stall door fully open, the barn's wide exterior gate already standing open behind her. A clear, unbroken path leading from the stall straight out into the open pasture beyond. Freedom, unguarded, unobstructed, the exact opposite of every instinct that would tell a person to control a dangerous animal more tightly, not less. Clive's expression breaks first into confusion, then into something closer to alarm, already opening his mouth to object, to point out the recklessness of releasing an unpredictable animal in front of a state inspector with no rope, no barrier, nothing at all standing between 400 acres of open running room and a horse the whole county has spent months describing as a killer waiting to happen. Goliath does not run. He stands in the stall doorway for a long moment, head raised, nostrils working the open air, the good eye taking in the wide pasture stretching out ahead of him. Every possible avenue of escape laid bare and unguarded for the first time since Nesta arrived on this property. The wind moves through his mane. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk calls once and falls silent. And then, instead of bolting for the horizon the way every person standing in that yard except one fully expects him to, he turns his head instead toward Nesta, standing motionless a few feet away, and walks toward her. Not quickly, not with any theatrical flourish, just the same steady, patient gait he has learned over these past weeks carrying water down from the creek, crossing the yard at an unhurried pace while three grown adults watch in absolute silence, until he reaches her and lowers his head, pressing his forehead against her shoulder, standing there, utterly still, in front of the entire assembled proof of everything the town believed about him. Marsh lowers his clipboard slowly. He does not say anything for a long moment, simply watching the animal stand there, calm, unrestrained, entirely by choice. When he finally speaks, it is not to Clive, and not with any particular warmth. Simply the flat observation of a man recording what he has actually witnessed rather than what he was told to expect, that in 15 years of conducting these inspections, he has rarely seen an animal choose to stay. Clive's face, in the silence that follows, undergoes its own quiet collapse. The practiced sympathy and procedural concern of the past several weeks finally giving way to something raw, something closer to the panic of a man watching a carefully built case dissolve in real time in front of the one witness whose opinion actually carries legal weight. He tries, once more, to redirect the conversation toward the highway expansion, toward community safety, toward the burden of expecting one woman alone to manage land this large. But Marsh, closing his clipboard with a small definitive motion, informs him, without particular emphasis, that his assessment today concerns animal welfare, not real estate development, and that on the specific matter he was sent to evaluate, he has seen more than enough. Clive leaves without another word, his truck kicking up a long trail of dust down the gravel drive, and something in the set of Nesta's shoulders, watching him go, one hand still resting against the horse's neck, suggests she understands this is not truly the end of it, only the end of this particular attempt. The weeks following the inspection pass with a quiet that feels, at first, almost suspicious in its calm. The complaint against the farm is formally dismissed. The water line, restored under threat of a separate inquiry Marsh apparently initiated on his own authority once he learned of its convenient timing, begins flowing again within days, though Nesta finds she has grown attached to the walk down to the creek regardless, and continues making the trip most mornings out of habit rather than necessity, Goliath falling into step beside her without a lead rope most days now, simply because he chooses to. Clive does not disappear entirely. He remains, for a time, a presence at the edges of things, a truck glimpsed at the end of the drive that no longer stops, a name mentioned occasionally at the feed store in tones that have shifted from certainty to something more careful, now that the story of the inspection has made its way, as these things do, through every corner of a small community that thrives on exactly this kind of retelling. The highway expansion survey markers remain staked in the western pasture for months longer than anyone expects, a quiet reminder that some fights end in a single afternoon and others simply go dormant, waiting for the next opportunity. Nesta does not celebrate, exactly. There is no single triumphant morning where the weight of the past several months lifts entirely. Instead, there is simply the accumulation of ordinary days that no longer contain the particular dread that defined the earlier ones. Mornings where she wakes in the front room of a farmhouse that has slowly, without her quite noticing the transition, begun to feel less like a stranger's inheritance and more like the shape of a life she is building on her own terms. She finishes reading the letters in full one evening in late autumn, the last of them, the unsent one, folded back into its envelope and placed not in the cedar box with the photographs, but in a drawer of the desk in the front room, close at hand rather than boxed away, not because the grief has resolved, but because she has found a way to carry it that does not require hiding it entirely. Goliath's blind eye never improves, of course. Some things do not heal simply because the fear around them finally does. But he moves through the pasture now with a confidence that has nothing to do with sight and everything to do with familiarity. The particular ease of an animal who has learned the shape of his own boundaries and no longer needs to fight against every unfamiliar sound to know he is safe within them. Winter arrives early that year, the kind of cold that turns the pasture hard and silvers the grass with frost by mid-morning. Nesta keeps the farm running through it with a competence that would have surprised the woman who arrived that first evening with 2 suitcases and a cedar box, though she has stopped being surprised by herself somewhere along the way. She hires no ranch hands. Not yet, though she has begun, cautiously, to consider it, less out of necessity now than the simple recognition that a farm this size was never meant to be run entirely alone, and that accepting help is not the same failure it once felt like. A young man named Dale Whitfield, the son of a rancher 2 properties over, begins appearing on weekends that winter, ostensibly to help with fence repairs, though the arrangement settles quickly into something closer to an apprenticeship neither of them names directly. He is careful around Goliath in a way that suggests he has heard every version of the town's old stories and remains half convinced of them despite the evidence standing calmly in front of him. A caution Nesta recognizes, watching him, as not so different from her own first weeks on the property, learning slowly that the things people fear loudest are often simply the things nobody bothered to understand quietly. Clive Harmon's name comes up less and less as the season turns. The co-op board, according to the feed store clerk, has begun asking its own quiet questions about the timing of certain complaints and the convenient placement of certain survey markers. Questions that will likely take years to resolve fully and may never resolve in any way that satisfies anyone completely. The ordinary, unglamorous aftermath of a small injustice that was stopped before it finished, rather than punished after the fact. On the first real snowfall of the winter, Nesta walks out to the barn before dawn, as she has most mornings for months now, and finds Goliath already standing at the open stall door, waiting, the way he has learned to wait for her rather than for the sound of a latch or the promise of feed. She does not read to him that morning. There is nothing left in the envelope she has not already read a dozen times over. Instead, she simply stands beside him in the cold blue light before sunrise, one hand resting against his neck, watching her breath fog in the air, and he stands with her, patient, unhurried, in no rush at all to be anywhere else. The farm still bears Everett's name on the mailbox, though it belongs now, in every way that matters, to the woman who learned to run it alone. The scars on Goliath's flank never fully fade, and neither does the clouded eye that first told her, all those months ago, exactly why he fought so hard against a world that kept approaching him from the side he could not see coming. Some wounds simply become part of the shape a creature learns to live inside. What changed was never the horse. It was the woman willing to sit outside a locked door long enough to understand what the silence on the other side of it was actually saying.